You're listening to No Early GGs.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to episode 61 of the No Early GGs FPL Draft Podcast. I am by myself this week, so it might be a bit of a shorter episode as I have no one to banter back and forth with, but Noah is traveling the world, so he's out there scouting new FPL potential players for us for next season or maybe in the January transfer window. Last week was pretty terrible for me. My team scored 27 points in total. Off the top of my head, Morris is probably the only one that did anything of note. He ended up with 10 points in his double game week, and that is because of his goal in the first game. And then the only other player on my team that did not score only 1 point was Mudryk, who I picked up instead of Fabio Vieira right before the game week started. And yep, every other person on my team scored 1 point, bar Kabore, who scored 1 point in one of his games. So Salah, Matoma, Ferguson, Andreas. I picked up Zaniolo as well. I think I'm going to immediately drop him. It was a pretty terrible game week for me, and it's probably the last time I'm trusting Everton because they proved they can't even beat Luton in a match. Let's go to Noah's team very quickly. It looks like he won. He scored 44 points. Matty Cash and Gabriel got clean sheets. Isak scored, I believe, and Lyle Foster scored as well. So, good week from Noah. He climbs up to 6th in the table. I drop down to 2nd on total points. So, looking to bounce back in the next game week this weekend. Waivers this week are at 6 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday, October 6th. So we have a little bit of we don't have that Thursday deadline this week, so you have a little bit more time to figure out your waivers. Let's get into those games. The one thing I do want to point out is that there are a ton of newly flagged significant players this week. The big one, I believe, being Saka from their Champions League game. He went out injured in the first half, I believe. Estupiñán also newly red flagged. Emery had a quote today about Diaby potentially not being available. And then we still have the other players. I'm thinking of my own players right now. Botman is still out. Gusto is still out. A bunch of players that have probably been picked up recently that need to be taken into account during waivers this week. So the first game is Tottenham versus Luton. I think we all have potentially the same prediction for this game. Spurs have looked very attacking and a very good side under Postecoglou since the start of the season. Their last win against Liverpool was a little bit dicey, and I say a little bit, it was probably the diciest game I think anybody has ever seen in terms of VAR. But they come up against Luton, who got their first win of the season against Everton this week, but I don't see them recreating that. So this is one of those games where it's Tottenham all the way. I would probably start everybody on their team except for Basuma, who is kind of more holding than Sarr. So their normal lineup being Porro, Romero, Van de Ven, Udogi, Basuma, Sarr, Madison, Son, Kulusevski, and then it's kind of swapped between Richarlison, Brennan Johnson, and Solomon. So I think those players could still have an impact off the bench. So I think any Tottenham player, particularly the attackers who might rotate a little bit, are good plays against this Luton side. In terms of Luton, I think Morris is probably the only one you can trust. He's on their penalties, so I think he's probably the only person that I would play from this team, particularly against a team as good as Spurs. The next game is Fulham versus Sheffield. So I think one of the big groups of players that I'm considering this week are Fulham defenders. They're probably available in smaller leagues than ours. There's a couple available in our larger 12-man league. Tim Ream, Issa Diop are the two that are available, but Castagna and Anthony Robinson would be great picks for this week as well. I do want to take this time to say Andreas hasn't been the best asset so far this year, so I am a little bit on the fence about him, but I see Willian taking some of their corners, and I think that was Andreas's big value, and he no longer has Mitrovic on those set pieces as well. So I think his value has dropped for me a little bit. I'm not really sure what to do about it because, especially in a 12-man league, there's not really anything better that you can get, and I'm just hoping he's still on those penalties that Fulham can potentially get. On the Sheffield end, they haven't really had anybody very good pop up other than potentially Cameron Archer. I would probably even consider Hammer in bigger leagues than 12, but I think Archer's the only one I would probably start right away. I know Noah probably agrees with me given his viewpoints on Oliver McBurney. The next game is Burnley versus Chelsea. We actually saw Chelsea win a game against Fulham 2-0. It was Mudryk and Broja in the first half that secured the victory, but Mudryk also went off injured, and he is now yellow flagged. So in terms of Chelsea's lineup against Burnley, which, in past seasons we would have said is a very winnable game, I actually do see Burnley scoring. Lyle Foster has seemed to have found his feet pretty quickly, and I would probably start him in this game. I don't know about other Burnley players, but he is their furthest player forward. In terms of Chelsea, so Chilwell, I mentioned Mudryk's injury. Chilwell is also now flagged as well, so that left flank is a little bit open and it's kind of dicey on who's going to start for this team. I am a little bit more unsure about their defense than their attack. I think Palmer was probably the best attacking player. I don't think he got an attacking return in the game against Fulham, but he looked like Chelsea's best player in that game, so if I were going for an attacker on Chelsea, it would be him right now. I still do have Jackson. Broja scored, but it wasn't the best chance, and he also skied an open goal earlier in the game. So interested to see what their lineup looks like, but I would expect Palmer to start the next game as he was their best player, and I would probably start him against Burnley. The next match we have is Man U versus Brentford. So I want to start off this is going to upset Noah, I think, a little bit. I haven't checked his team to see how many of these Man U defenders he still has on his squad, but they don't look like they're keeping clean sheets anytime soon. Onana made another mistake in their Champions League game as well. They just lost to Crystal Palace 1-0 as well. Brentford last year beat them 4-0. I can't remember if it was in this venue or the reverse fixture, but I would probably start Brentford attackers, Mbeumo, Wissa, Jensen, and probably Norgard. I don't think we've really seen the downsides of missing Rico Henry yet, but I do think they will be seen if they are playing a 3-5-2, or if they even can't anymore because of his absence. He was pretty vital on that left side, so I'm interested to see how Brentford do in their potentially biggest game since he's been out fully. So we'll see how Brentford do, but I would still be playing those Man U attackers, even though they haven't been looking great recently. Rashford, Fernandes. I'm a pretty big Højlund believer, even though I don't think he scored a Prem goal yet, but he did score twice in the Champions League this week. So I think he's going to be looking to ride that confidence into this game and get another goal. The next game is Everton versus Bournemouth. This one does not look great in terms of watchability. I made the mistake of kind of accidentally starting two Everton players against Luton. I wavered for Ashley Young, forgetting that Pickford was starting for me, and they did not keep a clean sheet, and they also lost. So I'm a little bit unsure about if I'm still going to start Pickford if I have Ashley Young in my team, but I don't think Bournemouth is the worst fixture. It's still Everton, though, so I as of yet have not decided what I'm going to do with those two players. I might end up ditching Ashley Young and starting Pickford regardless. I do think that Doucouré is probably the best start in this game for me. Beto and DCL, it seems like it's a little bit of a toss-up. I would expect Calvert-Lewin to start if he's healthy, but Doucouré has been producing with both of them in front of him, so I think he's probably the most surefire point getter for me in this game. I would also start Solanke from Bournemouth, but I think other than that, I would avoid this game altogether unless you think that one of these teams is going to keep a clean sheet, which could potentially happen with the way that these two teams play, but I think I'm going to stay away from this one altogether unless I start Pickford. The next game is Crystal Palace versus Forest. This one's probably the biggest toss-up for me. Crystal Palace have been kind of up and down. They recently beat Man U. Forest is somewhat of the same. They did beat Chelsea, but that's not saying much anymore. Mateta started for Palace this week, but I do believe Edouard is back based on his flag, and I think he will be the starter. So we'll see. They did win with Mateta. I think that's something to consider. He has been producing off the bench. So if you are in dire need of a forward, I don't think Mateta off the bench against Forest is the worst. In terms of Forest, I think it's still really Awoniyi or Gibbs-White. In terms of the defenders, I don't really see either of these teams keeping a clean sheet against each other, but I know Noah picked up Joel Ward a couple weeks back. I don't think he's still on his team, but I would probably start Anderson, who is the highest scoring defender in the game right now, and that would go for Guehi, Mitchell, and Ward as well. That's their back line. In terms of Forest defenders, they do have Luton next on their schedule after this, and as we all know, I've been targeting Luton, so if you want to get ahead and maybe have a flyer on one of their defenders going forward for this next game after this Palace game, I think you could still start them against Palace as well. But Forest's back line against Brentford looked like Aurier, Bolly, Murillo, and Niakate. They kind of rotate a little bit, so we might expect that to change, but I think Aurier is probably the most surefire pick out of those guys there, other than Matt Turner, of course. Brighton versus Liverpool is the next game. Now, this is one of the most exciting games of the game week. I think there's one that trumps it. I think you all know which one I'm talking about. Liverpool have decent fixtures for the following two. I am expecting a lot of goals in this game, and we will be missing Gakpo potentially, who went off injured in this Spurs game, and Jota also got one of those two red cards that Liverpool received in that game. So I think we can expect a front three of Diaz, Nunez, and Salah. And I would expect them to score against Brighton, who just shipped 6 goals against Villa and are now missing Estupinian, who contributed to those 6 goals by scoring an own goal. So maybe it'll get better. I honestly have way more trust in the Brighton attackers at this point than their defenders, which should come at no surprise. But it's kind of the question of who is actually starting in these games. I know at the start of the season, when Noah and I were talking draft strategy, I talked about avoiding City players in my past, and I have essentially drafted my way into a similar situation by picking Matoma and Ferguson, one of which Ferguson has played 45 minutes twice, I believe, and Matoma is probably the best attacking option on their team, but he plays a lot wider than I think he did last season, so I'm hoping to see him pick up the attacking returns, although I can't really be complaining. I believe he has 3 goals and 3 assists already this season. Yep, that is correct. I just confirmed that. Like I said, I do expect goals. In terms of defenders, I probably trust the Liverpool defenders more at this point than Brighton, especially considering that they just gave up 6 goals. So I mean, if you're really in a pickle, I would pick Liverpool defenders, but I really don't want any defenders from this game whatsoever. The next game is West Ham versus Newcastle. Botman is probably still going to be out. He's orange flagged. I can see this game being the opposite of the game we just talked about. I can see it being pretty low scoring. Newcastle started with Lascelles at center back instead of Botman last game. It worked. They kept a clean sheet. I think the question is whether Target or Hall starts instead of Lascelles and Byrne goes to left back, but I do think we can expect Lascelles to start again, and he would be a good pickup. Newcastle obviously have a good defense. I already have Pope, so if I don't start Pickford, I think I'm in a pretty good spot, and I'm already covering that Newcastle defense, but I think Lascelles is a good waiver this week. The other thing is Gordon is now suspended. due to yellow card accumulation. Barnes is also out. Do we see Wilson and Isak start together? I think the question is no. I'm now remembering that I believe Wilson is injured now as well. Newcastle just beat PSG 4-1 in the Champions League. Gordon was obviously allowed to start that game, but I don't think we'll see him play I know we won't see him play in the Premier League. He's suspended, so I suspect the wingers will be Jacob Murphy and Almiron. So Murphy against West Ham, I think you could do worse. If you need a 1 week starter for Newcastle, he would be that guy. West Ham, in terms of their players, I think they've had the usual suspects for the past couple seasons now. Bowen, I would probably start. Ward-Prowse, I would probably start. And probably Paqueta and Antonio. You could definitely do worse than them, but I think the only surefire players I would be starting are Bowen and Ward-Prowse, depending on the other options that you have available. I don't expect them to keep a clean sheet against Newcastle. Next game is Wolves versus Villa. I think the main thing we got to talk about, Wolves beat City 2-1. Hwang, or the Korean guy, and Pedro Neto, I was going to say scored. He led to Diaz's assist, but Pedro Neto, I very much regret dropping him for Enzo Fernandez. That's a terrible waiver in hindsight. I think you got to start him. I know Villa's probably the better team, but Neto I would probably start. I'm a little bit on the fence about Hwang. He does have 3 or 4 goals, so maybe I should stop being on the fence about him if he's available. But saying that, I do think I would start Villa defenders in this one. They looked phenomenal against Brighton. And I'm going to bring it up again. I picked up Zaniolo. I was pretty excited about him. He looked pretty terrible, in my opinion. Very wide, not really involved in the play, even though they scored 6 goals, which is honestly pretty impressive. And, I mean, at this point, Diaby and Watkins, you have to start them every week, regardless of who they play. I believe Diaby, there's a potential that he's out, so I would keep an eye on what Emery says after their European games, and that might lead me to keep Zaniolo. I don't know who's going to start instead, maybe John Duran, but I would keep an eye on that Villa news going forward this week to see who's going to start for their team. The last game of the game week is Arsenal versus City. I think we all know this is a great fixture. This is a toss-up. I really don't know how you can predict who's going to win this game. Both these teams have great attacking options. The main news right now is if Saka is going to play. Rodri is still out for City, so I think that hinders them a little bit. If I had to choose one, I would probably start the City defense, just because, how can you really go against them? But if you're in a pickle, I think the usual Arsenal defenders, White, Saliba, you guys know who they are, so I'm not going to list them out, but I don't know if I would start them this week if I had them, because it is City, but they are capable of keeping a clean sheet against anyone. We saw that last year when they almost won the league. So, I mean, all these players are probably picked up at this point. It's kind of up to you whether you would play them or not, but I think I would lean City in this game just because of how dominant we know they can be. That is going to do it for episode 61 of the No Early GG's FPL Draft Podcast. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will have Noah back next week. So just remember,
You're listening to No Early GGs.